Good afternoon. So I'll tell you in advance that I have about 130 slides and I'm going to do it in about a half an hour or so. Don't be spooked if I run through a bunch of them. Some of you that may want copies, I'll be glad to provide them, but I've got a lot of data and I'm not a guy who reads my slides, so I'll kind of ramble along a bit and that'll be the backdrop. I'm going to talk a little bit about the world around us because I think it's important to understand what we're doing today is not what we have been doing, and secondly, the world is changing very, very dramatically. And so if you look back and you say, how did we build successful companies over the last 30 or 40 years, the companies that we build going forward are going to be violently different. It may also sound like I'm writing the obituary for the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm not, so I'll end up with some more positive results. But I think the challenge for the pharmaceutical industry broadly is whether we are dinosaurs of the current generation. That is to say, can we adapt fast enough before we become extinct? And so the challenge is very, very real if you're sitting in the boardrooms of any of the big pharma companies trying to deal with a very, very rapidly changing marketplace. So I'm going to start there and then I'll develop the theme a little bit. And the theme will be built around a confluence of technology and what that means to the world, and also about some opportunities in the emerging markets. First of all, we don't live alone. We're very much a part of a much larger construct, and the world is pretty messy right now. Notwithstanding whatever you read in the paper or whatever you believe, we're not done with the sovereign debt crisis, and that has major impact on the world around us. We're an industry that has been fueled by capital. Capital has provided us innovation, tools for innovation, and the capital markets are just plain ugly, and they're going to get worse before they get better, notwithstanding all the kind of good news that comes out of the Davoses of the world. But if you look at the key countries of the world, you look at Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Greece, even the United States, you see that the percentage of debt relative to the GDP is awesome. You get countries where the debts are 140, 150% of their GDP and growing, not shrinking. And so that has dramatic impact. And if you look just at the last few months and you look on the right on this slide, you see that most of the market indices in which we exist have gone negative. And we're dependent on many of those things to access capital. It isn't to say it's been all bad. I was chairman of Pharmaset for 7 years. As you know, we recently sold Pharmaset for $11 billion to Gilead, and one of the biggest transactions that's happened. Offline, I can tell you how that happened. It was a fun story to be a part of. Also was a founding money in Inhibitex, which is just recently announced a big acquisition with Bristol Myers. So money has been made on the M&A business. There's value that has been created on the M&A business. But one challenge that we have is that by and large, the model in which we did innovation was we brought innovation out of academia. Guys like us financed it for decades. We did A rounds and B rounds and C rounds and D rounds. We took those companies public. We added more capital in a public equity way. We eventually brought product to the market and then did deals with big pharma. That world is over. We don't have that kind of capital in the system today. The VCs, by and large, are out of money. We just raised some money, but by and large, the industry is in trouble. And so the way we used to do it and the way innovation will happen in the future will be dramatically changed. I think it's also appropriate to recognize that we built the pharmaceutical industry really on a blockbuster theory. That is to say, our goal was to build very significant drugs in very significant markets with very significant resources developed around marketing and distribution, and that world is really over. We're not going to have any more $14 billion drugs as we did in Lipitor. And if you look at the world of personalized medicine, I'll go into that in a little bit, we're still going to have blockbuster drugs if we define that as a billion-dollar drug. We're just not going to have an industry driven by multitudes of billion-dollar drugs, and we'll be real happy with drugs that are $300 to $500 to $700 million or maybe $1 billion. One thing to remember just in terms of the language that we use, when we talk about personalized medicine, we're not really talking about something which at the far end of the spectrum is totally customized medicine where you've got one disease for one patient, one drug, and therefore there's no billion-dollar markets in personalized medicine. We can still have billion-dollar products in a personalized medicine world, but I think a lot of people put blockbusterology at one end of the spectrum and personalized medicine at the other end of the spectrum and think that as we move towards personalized medicine, it doesn't mean we're going to have big and successful drugs. And certainly if you look at the genzymes of today, you can see that we can still do well with orphan indications and small market drugs that ultimately become very, very successful and drive enormous value. But what you're seeing is a giant focusing by the big companies. You see a giant focusing by the small companies. Certainly the Geron moving out of the stem cell era. There's no question that scientifically we've seen enormous progress in stem cells. We will continue to see enormous progress in stem cells. But the Gerons of the world just can't afford to continue to invest and invest and invest in things that are maybe as much as 5 or 10 years away from being in the marketplace. So companies, small companies like Geron, big companies like the big pharmaceutical companies are increasingly trying to focus on nearer term opportunities and nearer term objectives. And then finally, just in the capital markets, I would mention that one of the things that happened in the last year is that the kind of expectation reality gap has been ugly. That is to say, if you looked at Dendreon and you looked at the expectation of Provenge up until it literally got to its market entry, the stock varied around a little bit, but moved up very dramatically. And as soon as market entry happened, people went, oops, it's not going to be quite as good as we thought, and you saw dramatic resettling down of the stock. And so the markets anticipate that we're going to do well, but then penalize us and then basically buy the sales and earnings. They don't buy the expectations. For those of you who are building companies, that tells you that you want to sell on the perceived value, and perceived value are there well ahead of actual intrinsic value. And so you're trying to build the highest perceived value, which is generally significantly before market entry. If you take something like Pharmaceuticals that we sold for $11 billion, first sales of their Hep C drugs will be in 2014, yet we built an $11 billion company. So it's not all bad. As I said, I'm not trying to write the obit. I'm just trying to put a few fence posts down in the areas that the world is going to be different. We've made some success in personalized medicine. I was at a large meeting yesterday in New York on the personalized medicine world, but I think we will continue to succeed in personalized medicine. I will define it differently than some, but by and large, we're talking about targeted therapies using our understanding of molecular abnormalities or molecular nuances to target drugs at specific molecular indications. What we have to remember in personalized medicine is that we have defined disease dramatically differently. And so as we define disease around some molecular abnormality, then we have to basically be able to identify that abnormality and know what particular drug is going to work for that particular problem. And so those of you that represent the pharmaceutical world largely live in a world where you talk about companion diagnostics. And I want to get you to understand that the real language is going to be that we have companion therapeutics, because the DX is going to have the value, not the RX, and the RX are going to look more like the commodity chemicals of tomorrow based on the value in identifying actually what's wrong and what drug's going to work for it. So the language is kind of backwards right now, because we tend to talk about this in the context of companion diagnostics, and we're actually going to live in a world of companion therapeutics. Good news is our friends at the FDA approved more drugs this year than they had in the last several years. Most people think that's great. I think it's more of a coincidence of facts than it is. I think if you asked whether the regulatory burden has gone up or down, it's certainly gone up. If you put on your congressional hat, the Congress continues to say to the FDA, why are you approving these things that we can't afford to pay for? And so while a test at the FDA level has been a two-pronged safety and efficacy test, clearly we live in a world where pharmacoeconomic efficiency is a reality. It's as difficult to get things through the marketplace and get them paid for than it was to get them approved. And so we as an industry have dramatically underappreciated the nuances of having to do the development at the beginning to get it paid for while you're doing the clinical development. So you're going to have to build the case with a payer that value has been created. I think the other thing to remember, and we'll talk, a lot of people are talking about the value of comparative effectiveness. The challenge of comparative effectiveness falls on us, that is to say the innovator. It doesn't fall on the big companies. So the things that are in the marketplace don't have to prove that they're comparatively effective against the new entrants. The new entrants have to prove that they work better and cost less, and so it's put an extraordinary burden on the small companies and a big barrier to entry for the big companies. So I went to the NIH recently and I said, you know, this is all great, but you're just killing the innovators because we have to do that test, others don't. So we have regulatory barriers around the world that will continue to go up, but more importantly, we're moving to the three-tier test, that in order to really get regulatory approval in most places around the world, you're not only going to have to prove safety and efficacy, but you're going to have to prove that it brings more value and costs less for the marketplace. On the good news pile, we've got an increased customer base. We've crossed the 7 billion person mark in the world. That's a lot more customers for us. And by and large, they're an aged population. And as you all know, aged people consume a lot more drugs and a lot more healthcare needs. And so we have both the absolute demographics of more people and then the aging population, which are very much in our favor. We'll talk in a minute about China. China's got 1.3 billion people. What you forget is China has 300 million people over 65 years of age. So it's got a whole United States of old people. And those people, by and large, smoke and aren't in very good health. And so the healthcare needs in a place like China are absolutely extraordinary. China, as many of you know, passed universal healthcare reform last year and said by 2017 we'll provide universal healthcare for everybody in the country. And between us kids, there's no way they can do that without bankrupting the country with the demand on the healthcare system. So in the world that we live in, we have to put that as opportunity as opposed to a problem. So I think what we're going to talk about here today is kind of what's happening in the pharma world and what does that mean? What does innovation look like and where are we going? How are the emerging markets reshaping a little bit the opportunity? And kind of how does drug delivery and drug delivery technology fit into all of that? So if you look at our friends in pharma for a minute, we're kind of in deep yogurt. We're going to lose most of our revenue base over the next 3 years through patent expirations. We have enormous pressure on our products for showing more value. We no longer can kind of throw them over the wall and get them paid for, but we have to prove that they're reducing the cost of healthcare. Because of the patent expirations, we have massive generic competition. You all may know that 76% of the scripts written in the United States today are already written for generic drugs, and so we live in a generic drug world, notwithstanding the fact that most of us are on the ethical side. And if you look at things like Lipitor, notwithstanding whatever Pfizer is trying to do, which is admirable, we're moving very, very fast. That went from a $14 billion drug to less than $2 overnight, and they're doing a wonderful job, but they're still getting killed. Drug development costs continue to go up. It's what's really interesting about drug development costs is that if you look at the real story, it used to take us about 7 years to get a drug to market at a cost of about $200 million, and so that's the blue line. And if you think about that, you had lots of time then, 15 years or so, before the patent expired in which to recover your investment, and you were only down $200 million. Today we're talking about something that may take 15 years and you're down 1.5, so it costs us 7 times more and twice as long. If you look as a result, you look at the area under the curve, there's nothing left. And so if you want to know why the pharmaceutical industry is in trouble, that chart would tell you that the cost of development against the time to recover that investment, it doesn't work today. And less than 1 in 3 drugs that ever get to the marketplace ever recover their cost. And so, simply stated, that's why pharma's in trouble. So return on investment is down. If you look at the spend, we're spending about $50 billion in big pharma on R&D. We're spending about $35 billion in the biotechs on R&D. We're spending about $30 billion at the NIH. And so we're spending in excess of $100 billion a year. And we're not getting very much for it. We're getting about 20 or 30 drugs out the back end. So it doesn't work. And so big pharma companies are basically getting out of the R&D business. If you look at all of them, they're cutting dramatically. And if you think about that for a minute and you were head of R&D 5 years ago, you looked down the hall and you said, how are we doing? And we were on the whole spending about 20% of the sales dollar in R&D. In 2 years, if you're head of R&D of any big pharma company, you look down the hall, there's going to be nobody there. And the reason is that big pharma is going to access virtually all of its innovation outside. They will, like Gilead did on Pharmasset, they will buy things where risk has been removed, and they're willing to pay a little more for it, but they aren't willing to own that risk. And so you can see the R&D-izing of big pharma. Technically, they'll keep a little d, but most of R will disappear. And that's because in the new companies and the smaller companies, we can be far more efficient. And so you see the massive impact of pharma slashing their jobs. And you see guys like Chris Viehbacher saying, I'm going to spend less, and he says, I'm never going to inaugurate a new R&D center. So here's one of the industry leaders, a good friend of mine, saying, R&D is dead, I'll buy it, I'll pay for it after risk is removed. Steve, if you want to invest in it, and your friends want to invest in it, that's fine. I'll be glad to reward you for the things that work, but I'm not going to do it inside. Wall Street actually likes that. If you look at the companies that have been cutting R&D, they've outperformed the companies that haven't. So Wall Street says, yeah, that looks like the right answer to us. We don't want to spend money on R&D. And yet, if you look back just a few years, you see companies like Merck being the most respected companies in the world because of what they were doing to reduce healthcare problems in the world. And they were on the cover of every magazine being the most respected companies. And today, pharmaceutical companies are less respected than tobacco and firearms. And so in less than 10 years, we went from the most respected industry to the least respected industry. And now we're in deep yogurt because the question is, can we survive at all? And the real reason is that, unfortunately, 60% of the American people think that we, the pharmaceutical industry, are the problem. And that the problem with the escalating healthcare costs is because we're ripping off the world. In fact, we're only represent about 10% of the healthcare cost. You could eliminate all that 10% and we're in deep yogurt. But the fact is that the public, 60% of the people, believe we're in trouble, and so the pharmaceutical industry is really a sector in crisis. But we as an industry relied on a couple of principles. One was to identify new blockbusters, and that's been the mantra on which we've existed for the last 50 years. We used our scale to do large and complex and expensive clinical trials that nobody could afford, and then we marketed the hell out of them. What you have to remember is 5 years ago, the United States government bought less than 5% of the drugs sold in America, and within a year, the United States government will pay in excess of 80% of the drugs sold in America. So you don't need 50,000 detail people calling on every doc in every little town. If basically CMS is your customer, and you just have to get on the formulary. So we see massive shift as the pharmaceutical industry is trying to deal with a changing environment. And between us kids, if you think about big pharma formatted and you say, what do they do better than anybody else? Do they do discovery and development better than anybody else? No. We're basically outsourcing that to the biotechs and the innovators. Do they do clinical development? So go up above that and say, do they do clinical development better than anybody else? The answer is no. We already are outsourcing that to Quintiles and PPD and the whole CRO industry. Do they do manufacturing better than anybody else? No, we can get manufacturing done in China or India or Poland or other places on a contract basis cheaper, and we can do it ourselves. So if you think about the pharmaceutical industry, which was historically a very vertically oriented industry, what you're left with is the only thing that they can really do better than anybody else is sales and distribution. And so now you're taking an industry that was organized vertically, and now it's organized horizontally, where you have to be very, very powerful at sales and distribution in a business where, interestingly enough, most of the customers are government healthcare systems around the world. And interestingly enough, if you look at the emerging countries that we're talking about, that represented only 13% of big pharma sales 5 years ago, and will represent more than 60% of big pharma sales in 5 years. And voila, the big pharma companies that were powerful in the US and Europe and Japan are not the companies that are powerful in those emerging markets. So big pharma is in relatively deep trouble. Now we do have new technology. Many of us are involved in that. Oral delivery is increasingly important. Nanotechnology is coming along. I want to remind you that outside of the world that we live in, there also is a confluence of technology which is very, very important to us that I think we frequently make a mistake and forget, because the new iPhones are changing the healthcare delivery. And so when we talk about personalized healthcare, we forget that I can push a button on my iPhone here and I can show you live my EKG happening right in front of you, right through my shirt. And so when we talk about personalized medicine, we're moving into a world of digital health. There are 7 billion people in the world today. 6 billion of them have cell phones. We have 100,000 applications for healthcare on the iPhone today. We happen to own this company I just showed you, but there's technology that's totally changing the nature of care for diabetes and heart disease and all the other things. And so we're moving from a totally dysfunctional sickness care system to an increasingly functional wellness care system with a very different set of technologies than we've had. All of us in this room are largely in the new molecules or us business, but the real healthcare world is changing on the other end to technologies that are telling us what's wrong with us and what's going to be wrong with us. We'll have little cell phones that we can spit on them. We'll have a little microfluidics chip in there, and it'll go up to the magic computer in the sky and do all those things that we used to do when you sent your your sample to a lab and it came back to your doctor and he told you what's wrong. So we need to think more holistically in this room about how healthcare is changing, not just how drug discovery and development and delivery is changing, because we're going to live in a relatively different marketplace. Now, those are opportunities for us, not necessarily problems. You have to put on the positive side of that and say, so how do I take advantage of all that change? Certainly, biosimilars are going to be a big piece of it. It was mentioned in the introduction. I got started in the biotech world in the late 60s and early 70s. The only reason I mention that is with 40 years of development of this industry, IP is only good for about 20 years, so we have at least 20 years of stuff that's off patent. So not only does the pharmaceutical industry have to deal with the onslaught of generics, but so does the biotech industry, where all of the blockbuster drugs of today are facing generic competition. I would tell you just off record for a minute, I just did the deal between Samsung and Biogen IDEC, a $500 million deal in the biosimilars area. And prior to that time, if you said Samsung's interested in pharmaceuticals and biotech, I thought they were a phone company or electronics company. And so we don't know who's interested in our future, but it isn't just the usual suspects. Personalized medicine, as I said, not only do we have drugs that are increasingly personalized, but we're also changing the nature of dosing and delivery. And we have lots of ways to deliver drugs today. That's what this industry in here is all about, different from the way we have historically done it. And we need to understand culturally that we're by and large a country that likes oral drugs. There are some countries that are less sensitive to oral drugs, much more interested in either specificity or effectiveness, and in many cases we'll deal with injectables, but we can't take our US perspective on drug delivery and apply it to the world because the world thinks of it quite differently. Certainly in our sector we've seen attractive growth. We've seen the rise in financing for drug delivery companies. We've seen the rise in deals, although the absolute number of deals have gone down, the value of deals have gone up. So it's not like we're being isolated. But if you're sitting there in a boardroom of any of the big companies today, you're saying, how do I deal with this massive change? And we're looking at becoming an OTC business. We're looking at generics. We're looking at emerging markets. We're looking at biosimilars. We're looking at what we do in those emerging markets and how we protect the technologies we have. And by and large, the boardrooms of all our friends in Big Pharma are looking at where the innovation is in the bio industry. Most of the drugs, most of the products of the future are going to be products of biology, not small molecule chemistry. One thing to remember about the emerging markets, and I'm going to begin to talk about that for a minute, and then in the panel that follows, we'll talk a little more about it. But first of all, each of those emerging markets is quite different. We can't look at them as the same, so I'll spend some time on that. But they are increasingly bringing a growing market and a growing market opportunity. As I indicated, if you look at deals, you see some unnatural partners. You see the Amgens doing deals with Watson. You see Quintiles and Biogen IDEC doing deals with Samsung. You'd say, well, who the hell is Samsung and what are they doing in our world? You see the big companies doing business in China. You see big pharma, no longer a small molecule business, but you see Pfizer, one of the major players in biologics through their acquisition of Wyeth. You see Novartis broadly in vaccines and biologics, and through Sandoz expanding their generics business. You saw Roche announce earlier this week spending $7 billion, $6.5 billion to acquire our friends at Illumina. And you say, what are they doing spending $7 billion buying a gene sequencing company? I happen to have my genome sequenced recently. I think relatively quickly all of you will, but right now there's just a few people in the world that have done that. But as we bring the price down below the $1,000 that we can do it at today, and we can sequence your genome at $100, Roche is betting that that's going to transform the world of diagnosis. You look at our friends at Teva. Teva just got a new CEO, a friend of mine, Jeremy Levin, who was a veteran of the biotech industry, a veteran of the pharmaceutical industry, ran strategy at BMS. So here is one of the biggest, most powerful generics companies both buying Cephalon, a biologics company, and then bringing a guy out of our industry to run those companies. And so all of the companies, Amgen strong in biologics, looking at small molecules, Teva strong in generics, looking at ethical drugs, Roche strong in therapeutics, looking at high-speed sequencing. We are seeing massive, massive change in the world around us. So what is Big Pharma doing? One thing it's doing is going back to school, which is interesting. It used to be that the things that came out of academia, we took them into the biotech industry. Guys like us financed them for years. We then eventually took them public and or sold them. Now, pharma's reaching over the biotech industry and doing deals right back with the academic sector. So you see that all over. I happen to think that's not likely to succeed, but it's an interesting phenomena. And you see the result of large-scale public-private partnerships on the way. You look at an absolute level at the small molecule drugs versus the biologics, you can see the curves are going in the other direction. Small molecules, much less important. Biologics, much more important. And you see the emergence of co-opetition. That is to say, big companies, Pfizer, Lilly, and Merck, intensely cooperating in an area and intensely competing in others. So we learned a lot about co-opetition in the Silicon Valley. In the electronics world, we're beginning to see co-opetition in our industry at a level that is unprecedented. We have to remember that the payer community, that is to say government healthcare systems around the world, are largely our customers. And if you look at those healthcare systems around the world, including ours in the United States, you basically have a three-tiered healthcare system. So at the lowest tier, you kind of have a government will pay for all. That's a system that wants as much for as little as they could get, so they're very happy to buy generic drugs cheaply. Above that, you kind of have a private healthcare system sponsored by insurance in various ways in various countries that allow people or companies to buy insurance and pay for things. Again, they're not likely to pay much more than the government system is because they know they don't have to. And then there's a third tier above that that's kind of a concierge system where the rich can pay whatever they want, however they want to do that. And if you think about where volume is in the lower two tiers, and so increasingly we're dealing with very, very powerful government payers who are trying to spread the limited amount of resources they have. We spend 20% of our GDP in this country. Most countries in the world spend 5 or 6, and they're trying to figure out how they get more for less, and we're trying to get the opposite. So I want to challenge you with something that is really a little bit out of here. And I want you to think about Twitter for a minute. So why is Twitter worth $10 billion? And maybe one of you can explain to me how, when somebody put out their 140-character message and you read their 140-character message, tell me where the revenue is in that. So if you want to play Angry Birds, you can do that for free as well. So what's the revenue model when you look at the Facebooks and the Zyngas and the Googles and the Twitters? The revenue model is not inside the product. We give the product away and we figure out that we're going to extract revenue some other way and build value. So somebody like Twitter today, $10 billion, somebody like Facebook maybe worth $20 or $30 billion, and the revenue is not in their product. We're in a business where we think of revenue and value creation in the product. We call it margin. And we're going to make money by selling our product. I think what we're going to have to learn in this industry is to take a page from others, and we're going to learn how to capture value outside of our product with data analytics and other things. Just another example to get you to think a little bit creatively. If you go to the grocery stores of the world, you think they're in the business of selling groceries to you, but everything that gets scanned as they go out and the credit cards you use to pay for it, they sell all that information to the Procter & Gamble's and the other companies of the world, and so those businesses are making money on the information, not making money on groceries. The electronics world, our friends at Facebook and Twitter, providing a service for you, everybody uses it, and they capture value outside of that. That's a foreign thought in our industry, and I think we're going to have to learn about how to capture value quite differently in what we do. You'll sleep on that tonight, and you'll say, what the hell was he talking about? But I think we're trying to think differently. So most of what I want you to think about is where the markets are for a minute. And the markets are increasingly in the BRICS and the CIVIC. CIVIC is Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, and Turkey. So not only do we have Brazil, Russia, India, and China, but we have a series of countries of the world that have hundreds of millions of people that are paying an enormous amount for healthcare. So let's drop back for a minute. What's really happened to the world around us? The world around us has become a very large, flat, interconnected, borderless marketplace with an exploding middle class. We don't like to admit it as a country, but on a relative basis, the US is far less important. So we're on our way to becoming a Britain of the world, kind of a country with a proud past and a much less significant economic role in the world. And while the politicians and the economists are struggling with that, we have to recognize that we're no longer the economic engine of the world, and we just hope that we can continue to play an important role in that. But we also have a kind of a naive view as Americans that democracy is a great answer, so we're going to pass democracy around the world. What we're allowing, by the way, parenthetically, is many of the people who hate us to be in power. But anyway, we're trying to export democracy around the world. And secondly, we think that our job is to level the playing field. So if everybody plays by the same rules, then the best man or woman will win. And in fact, if you look at most places in the world, they're increasing the regulatory burden to protect the local industries. We're trying to level the playing field and finding ourselves at a dramatic disadvantage. And if you look at most of the major countries of the world today that are emerging, the Russias and the Middle East and so forth, there's enormous political instability in places that we'd like to see are interesting. To go back to our industry for a minute, our industry, the pharmaceutical industry, by and large lived in a world in which the US, Europe, and Japan were kind of a third, a third, a third. We didn't worry very much about the rest of the world. We said ROW was maybe 10%, but basically concentrated our resources on capturing value in the US, Europe, and Japan. Now it's all the BRICS, so Brazil, India, Russia, China, the civic countries, increasingly powerful middle class, increasingly a big player in the marketplace, and rising with extraordinary economic power, China having surpassed Japan already, the United States moving down, China will be a more powerful economic power than we are in just a few years. You can see the growth of the GDP. You can see this on any chart by anybody. You can see the value in the marketplace of all of that. And you can see a new world order emerging in which we will succeed as companies if we play on a much more global marketplace, not betting the future on the US, Japan, and Europe. So no matter what statistics you'll see, they'll all keep coming up with the same kinds of answers for you. And if you look at where the middle class is growing, you see this emergence of a very powerful middle class in all those countries. And as people move out of poverty into an increasingly affluent society, the number one thing that they want is healthcare. And when you ask them about healthcare, they believe healthcare is a right, not a privilege. That is to say, they should get it for free or the government should provide it. They don't believe that this is something that they have to pay for. So the emergence of government healthcare systems as our customers are very, very important. And you can see how important the middle class is in these emerging economies. Pharmaceutical sales are already reflecting that China will be the largest single market in the world in 5 years, not there today, and very different with respect to lots of things. We in America kind of put China and India, Chindia together. We talk about it. We think, they're both billion-plus people. They're kind of far away. They're both emerging markets. Those countries are as different. The market opportunities are as different. The cultures are as different. The products they're going to use are as different. The disease profile is different. We need to be far more sophisticated about how those countries work. Now, on the scary side, if you look at where scientific citations were up until about a year ago, 2 years ago, scientific citations to American scientists were always more than 50% of the aggregate scientific citations in the world. Last year, we crossed that barrier. There were more scientific citations to non-US scientists than there were to US scientists. And if you look at the growth of scientific citations, you see the same bunch of guys getting way ahead of us on the innovation curve. So we think we're the dominant country in stem cells, but all you need to do is go to places like China to understand, or Brazil, where today there's 23 stem cell trials underway. There are places outside the world that are far more advanced than we are in areas that we think are important. You see China leading the world on patent applications. You have to remember that the new patent law that we just passed was a first-to-file system, moving from a first-to-invent system, which means big companies and people running to the patent offices will be ahead of us. So we lived in a system where we thought if you really did the discovery and you really validated that in your lab books, you were going to be protected. Now the guys that get to the patent office first are going to be rewarded, and that probably isn't us, and so that also will add to an enormous disadvantage to us. So our friends in Big Pharma, many of you are aggressively looking at trying to build some resources in a number of those countries. There's capital to do that. I happen to have just raised a couple $100 million in Russia. We're spending a fair amount of time in Russia. We raised a couple $100 million in Brazil. We raised $100 million in China. And my own firm has money all over the world because those are important players. So we're not in Kansas anymore. We're at a little different place, and we're going to have to understand that. By and large, if you look at China and India, we used to think about them as places that we could rent scientists or rent manufacturing capabilities or rent people. Average FTE in China was $30,000. Average FTE in this country was 300. So if you could get 10 scientists for one, everybody said, wow, I'll arbitrage and get a lot more work done. In fact, most of those cost arbitrages have disappeared. There's a time arbitrage today because you can access very large bodies of treatment-naive patients, and you can get your clinical development done quicker. And so there's more of a time arbitrage than there is a cost arbitrage. But there really is a market arbitrage that we're just beginning to understand. It isn't that we're going to get cheaper development done, but our customers are going to be in those countries, and we're trying to move into a different place. But it's a big challenge. And it's a big challenge because if you look at the, quote, ease of doing business in many of those countries, it's tough, and it's going to get tougher. So we have IP issues, which are interesting, particularly in a number of them. We have corruption, which is an issue in many of them. We have complexity in starting a business with a lot of government intrusion. You have a changing world of innovation. You have a different world of customers. You have a different world of R&D. It is a relatively different world. Governments are both the providers in many cases, the approvers and the payers of healthcare. That's good. Looks a little bit like Scandinavia in that regard, where you've got government-controlled systems. We used to call it socialized medicine and think it was bad. Now we think it's good. But I think it's important really just to understand that these markets are quite different. So let's just close on that for a minute. You have rising middle class. You have incredible unmet medical needs. You have aging populations. You have government spending more and more of their GDP on healthcare. And most of those markets are generic markets. So you need to think branded generics rather than ethical drugs. And then I've got some slides here. I'll skip through them in the interest of time, but I think it's important to understand that you have different market opportunities, you have different risk sharing, and you have different ways to penetrate these. And I've got a whole series of slides. You can see examples of how both countries are trying to build that and companies are doing well. China, India, Brazil, Russia, they're all a little bit different. I happen to have operations in all those countries. I can tell you at the break a little bit more about the nuances of them, but they are our markets of the future, and they will be increasingly important. I think it's important to recognize on a global basis for a minute that the problems of rising healthcare costs are not a US problem. And while we talk about it and we're going to pass some more legislation about it and the Supreme Court is going to rule on Obamacare and everybody says, wow, that's really interesting, we're going to go through another set of issues as the Supreme Court rules about whether this thing called healthcare reform sticks. What you need to understand is in this country, the marketplace is way ahead of where the politics are. So it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says any longer. The marketplace is reforming way, way, way ahead of that, and that will continue. Public spending increasing, as I said, all over the world, and so we don't have just healthcare reform in the United States. We have it everywhere. The other thing to remember about healthcare for a minute is that all of those things that we did to cure all the acute problems have actually worked. And so the good news is that we don't kill as many patients as we used to. That is to say, people don't die of disease. So now 75% of our cost in the United States is for chronic care. And while it's not polite to say, a dead patient was a cheap patient. And when we're keeping everybody alive and you have an aging population, our healthcare cost is out of control today, where we're spending 80% of our healthcare costs on the last year of life, and governments are not going to be able to afford to keep Aunt Martha or your wife or your husband alive for another 6 to 12 months. And so while, again, it's not politically popular to talk about healthcare rationing and death panels, the fact is that we have unlimited healthcare demand and limited resources, and we're going to see a change in the way it's done. Non-communicable diseases, things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, increasingly important. We think in many cases about just the communicable diseases, but we're going to live in a world of dramatic change. So let me just close with a couple of summary comments. One is, I think, as you look at these partnerships and you look at technologies and you look at opportunities in emerging markets, you need to think differently. This is not just the United States. Someplace else, they have very different disease profile, very different culture, very different interests. We will largely live in a branded generics world. We'll largely live in countries where the traditional US and European pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies are not strong. They're strong in the places that the markets are not going to be as dominant. Delivery technology can be important, but don't misunderstand the difference between oral drugs and injectables and other forms of delivery in various countries. Understand price controls and paying for value. You can see in Germany today, and you can see in the UK today, and increasingly in the US, if you want to get your drug paid for, you're going to have to prove that it improves outcome and reduces cost, whether you like it or not. So I challenge you one more time to think about capturing value different. Understand that value is built on a perceived basis. In many cases, value is built before the product gets into the market. All of our job is to build value, not necessarily to build margin. And I want you to think about that differently. So we live in a world with rapidly changing science, this confluence of technology that's bringing us smartphone technology. We have to deal with different diseases, different clinical things, and so forth. Understand to succeed, we're going to in some way need to localize things. If you go and deal with the Russians, they want to know what you're doing in Russia. It's not just sending product to Russia. They're looking at country building. They're looking at company building in those places. The companies are intimately linked with their governments. You'll have to take a heavy dose of patience pills. Can't just fly to Shanghai, get off the plane, do a deal. You spend a lot of time trying to build relationships and build trust and under how the systems really work. You're going to have to adapt products to local needs. This isn't McDonald's or Coke selling the same thing all over the world. It's selling different products in different markets with different customers and different needs. And we really need to understand that and be very adaptable. We do all that well. There's extraordinary opportunity. We will see tremendous amount of innovation on one hand and tremendous amount of partnerships and opportunities on the other. So thank you very much. I think we're now going to have a panel discussion and try and expand on this a little bit. Thank you.